One of the most interesting interpretations of the interplay between Alicent and Rhaenyra that I've seen reiterated by fans and viewers almost everywhere revolves around Rhaenyra's suggestion that Jace and Helaena be betrothed and married. It's a vital aspect of the development of their relationship and the growing rivalry between the Greens and the Blacks, to be sure. But what is particularly interesting about it is the perception of what it means and the role that Alicent and Rhaenyra both play in it. On its face, it's a simple proposition. Rhaenyra's oldest son and Alicent's only daughter get married. A move that will theoretically heal the rift between both sides of Viserys' family, and will enable both the Greens and Blacks to eventually wind up with children who will inherit the Iron Throne. And many people seem to interpret this suggestion from Rhaenyra as an attempt to offer an olive branch to Alicent, since their relationship has deteriorated so massively by the time that she proposes it. However, the political nuances of this situation are almost entirely overlooked by many viewers who see this as a simple attempt to unite a fractured family. And those nuances are arguably the most important aspect of this entire scenario. Interestingly, this offer of betrothal between them is entirely a show invention. In the books, Jacaerys and Lucerys were engaged to Baela and Rhaena before they were 5 years old. And it doesn't appear that any other marriage options aside from Aegon were considered for Helaena. So, the question of why this particular plot point was created for House of the Dragon is an interesting one, and certainly lends credence to the idea that Rhaenyra was simply trying to reconnect with Alicent after being estranged for so long, since their entire relationship was also basically created for House of the Dragon. I suspect that the writers didn't intend for this to be solely seen as a straightforward attempt at reigniting their friendship, though, simply because the political implications of such a match are so multidimensional. But regardless of whether or not the writers intended to portray the complexities of this suggested betrothal, they still exist. And they pretty clearly illustrate a scenario that is not nearly as simple as Rhaenyra attempting to make peace and Alicent brutally rebuffing her. The most obvious issue here is Jacaerys' illegitimacy. While a lot of viewers seem to want to hand-wave away the importance of this problem by stating that Jace and Luke are somehow legitimized simply because they have been accepted as legitimate in the eyes of Viserys or Laenor, that just isn't how it works. This is a pretty obvious instance of applying real-world logic or morals to a fictional situation where these concepts are directly contradicted within canon itself. Interestingly, it's not as if this is a problem with no in-universe potential resolution either, and that is what makes it an even bigger issue. As has been demonstrated many times before, children can be legitimized by royal decree. While this type of legitimization seems to be used in cases of emergency only and is typically applied to benefit male children from a male bloodline, it's clearly not out of the question for Viserys to legally legitimize Jace and Luke. And ironically, one of the bigger problems with Jace and Luke's potential inheritance going forward is that neither Viserys nor Rhaenyra actually attempts to legitimize them. They simply act as if they are already legitimate children when they are very obviously not. Unfortunately for Rhaenyra, in this instance she doesn't have the kind of obvious cover that someone like Cersei has either. The War of the Five Kings was started as a result of the dubious legitimacy of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. But at least Cersei had children with someone who looked exactly like her, and therefore their paternity was more difficult to question because children who look like their mother wouldn't automatically be presumed bastards because they don't look like their father. But look at how far that suspicion went once the seed of illegitimacy was planted in the minds of many. And then consider that Jace, Luke, and Joffrey are in much deeper trouble because they don't look like their mother or supposed father. So at the time of the betrothal proposal, all of the strong boys are in an incredibly tenuous situation because basically everyone besides Viserys believes that they're illegitimate. But they haven't been legitimized and it doesn't look like they're going to be. Which would make Helena's marriage to Jace incredibly dangerous and a terrible proposition for Alicent and Helaena in particular. Given that with the exception of the Dornish, who weren't even united with the rest of Westeros under Targaryen rule at the time, women are essentially seen as property of their husbands in the world of Westeros. Being married off to someone whose inheritance is almost guaranteed to be contested, and who is presumed to be illegitimate, is a terrible proposition. If things ultimately go south for Jace, then Helena's life would be ruined and quite possibly ended as a result of the match. And when we're talking about a legitimate princess, her prospects for future marriage should have been the best in Westeros. So hitching her wagon to someone who was believed to be illegitimate and could wind up with absolutely nothing would have been a horrendous choice even in the best circumstances. But the even bigger problem that goes almost entirely unacknowledged by those that argue that a marriage between Jace and Helaena was a perfect solution that Alicent turned down out of bitterness or rudeness is that this is literally not a solution. It solves absolutely nothing. The fundamental problem that exists between the Greens and the Blacks is that Aegon is the legitimate male heir of Viserys Targaryen, while Rhaenyra is a woman and Jacaerys is a bastard. As Alicent clearly stated, Aegon's very existence is the challenge to Rhaenyra's entire bloodline, and marrying Helaena and Jace does nothing whatsoever to resolve or even affect that particular problem. Really, the only thing that it does do is ensure that whatever negative outcomes affect the Blacks will also affect Helaena, while also obviously putting pressure on the Hightower side of the family to support Rhaenyra in whatever she wants or needs, because if they don't, then Helaena could suffer the consequences. Undeniably, Rhaenyra is using Viserys' unwillingness to acknowledge the illegitimacy of her children to her advantage in this instance. And honestly, that is fair play. Sure, it's not a particularly nice thing to do to her sister, the rest of her siblings, or the Hightower side of the family. But exploiting your own political advantages is what nearly everyone would do in this situation, and Rhaenyra isn't being exceptionally evil by attempting to use Viserys' favoritism as a tool to cement her position and the position of her sons. However, by that same turn, Alicent is not being unreasonable or cruel by rejecting this proposition or recognizing it for what it was, which was an attempt for Rhaenyra to essentially trap Alicent and her children into supporting Rhaenyra and the Strong Boys once their legitimately almost inevitably was called into question. Rhaenyra was in an extremely precarious position as the heir to the Iron Throne in the first place. Even if she played her cards exactly right, in the eyes of many, she was not the rightful heir so long as there were direct and legitimate male descendants of Viserys Targaryen. And while many people are fond of arguing that the king's word is law, and therefore Rhaenyra's inheritance was unquestionable once Viserys simply named her heir, this is demonstrably not true. If the king's word was law, then deposing the Mad King Aerys would have been a crime, and rebellion against Joffrey would have been treason. And in turn, Aerys' mass slaughter of all the lords who called him into question, as well as Joffrey's execution of Ned Stark, would have been unimpeachable. Clearly, the king cannot just do whatever he likes, and the king's word is not law in the eyes of the people of Westeros. Even in the best of circumstances, the king's word is only law as long as that king is alive. And rearranging common inheritance order to favor his oldest daughter in a country where almost all of the power is held by men who inherited that power through their male bloodlines for thousands of years was not going to be an easy sell, even if Rhaenyra were a fantastic leader who made zero mistakes. But Rhaenyra made plenty of mistakes, and one of the biggest was attempting to make a suspected illegitimate child the heir of the Iron Throne. While the people of Westeros don't have access to 23andMe, many were understandably suspicious of the Strong Boys, which further negatively impacted Rhaenyra's claim to the throne because her rulership is already something that her misogynistic society would have been resistant towards. And with supposedly credible accusations of her children being bastards, that resistance would only grow. Westerosi societal structure is almost entirely built upon sexism and classism. And nearly everyone at the top of the power mountain is a rich man who has control over plenty of women and may have at least one illegitimate sibling. Supporting Rhaenyra's claim to the throne when there are legitimate sons available to take it was already an unappealing proposition because it would reasonably lead to at least some women questioning why they should not inherit over their brothers or other male family members. But it becomes doubly off-putting because after she takes the Iron Throne, she expects her bastard son to inherit after her. Clearly, the system of rule in Westeros is a terrible one, but this 1-2 punch of Rhaenyra as queen and Jace as king could cause a great deal of chaos for Westeros if it got any significant traction. If women and illegitimate children can now easily inherit the most powerful seat in the land, then what is to stop them from taking any other lordship or lands? And unfortunately for the men who currently possess nearly all the power, this isn't just a proposition regarding them potentially losing that power. Considering the societal standards of Westeros, the likelihood that at least some legitimate sons might be killed off so an ambitious woman or bastard can strengthen their claim to what they want is pretty high. So unfortunately, based on the world that they live in, Alicent and Rhaenyra, as well as their children, were always going to be positioned as rivals to one another, because Alicent's children and grandchildren and everyone in her bloodline would always have supporters arguing in favor of their reign unless and until their bloodline died out. But a marriage between Jace and Helaena was more likely to complicate that issue even further and leave the Greens at an even larger disadvantage. And both Rhaenyra and Alicent would have been aware of that when Rhaenyra made this proposal. Marriage in Westeros is complex. It is an agreement with a lot of economic, political, and social implications. And while Rhaenyra may have been Viserys' named heir, according to the standards of the country that have existed for millennia and that were in large part responsible for Viserys becoming king in the first place, Rhaenyra's position in the line of succession in the eyes of most people in Westeros would have put her as the fourth in line behind her three brothers at the absolute best. And according to the least generous interpretation, she would have been ninth in line behind her brothers, their sons, Daemon, and her sons with Daemon. So, were it not for Viserys' decree, which was made before almost all of these legitimate male heirs even existed, Rhaenyra's claim to the throne as well as Jace's claim would be essentially negligible. And therefore, Rhaenyra actually getting what she wants from this situation was going to be pretty difficult. But something like a marriage with Jace and Helaena would have made it easier. Rhaenyra made a colossal error by having obvious illegitimate children, but her plan to ameliorate this problem and cover her bases seems to be obvious, at least in the world of House of the Dragon. The Valyrians are not in an advantageous position with Rhaenyra, and she is essentially trying to steal their lands and titles from them. But if she could marry Luke to Rhaena, it serves a dual purpose. Of course, she makes the argument that because of this arrangement, the Valyrians will still have someone with Valyrian blood inherit Driftmark. But from a darker perspective, it also essentially gives Rhaenyra a hostage to keep the Valyrians in line, if things start getting messy for her and they want to bail out. Clearly, Alicent and her children pose an even bigger threat to Rhaenyra taking the Iron Throne or her sons ever inheriting it. So a marriage between Jace and Helaena would serve largely the same purpose. Even if the Greens had the better claim to the Iron Throne and had a great deal of support, obviously Alicent, Aegon, Aemond, and Daeron would be far more reluctant to actually take that power if it meant that Helaena would be brutalized or killed because of it. Given that this entire situation is built on the foundation of Viserys' commands and delusions, it's not surprising that Rhaenyra wants to shore up her support and have her bases covered before he's gone. And appealing to his desire to have his family reunited clearly would have made the offer of betrothal between Jace and Helaena an easier sell. But there are many other aspects at play here, and nearly every facet of this agreement would have benefited Rhaenyra at the expense of Alicent and her children. Obviously, this is something that would have been readily apparent to both Alicent and Rhaenyra. So to read Rhaenyra's offer as little more than a friendly attempt to mend fences, and to interpret Alicent's rejection as an unwillingness to heal a familial rift is an incredibly reductive way of seeing things. There are much deeper implications behind it. In Westeros, it is not particularly unusual for two rival families to arrange a marriage to essentially keep each other in line. So Rhaenyra isn't necessarily acting out of pocket in attempting to do this herself. However, she is almost certainly doing it because she knows that her claim and Jace's claim are going to be challenged, and the Greens are their clear challengers. She also knows that her oldest sons are illegitimate, and rather than resolving that situation in some other way, or not creating that situation in the first place, she is attempting to put the people who would have the biggest reason to act against her into a position where they essentially can't, at least not without hurting someone they love. Similarly, even if the Greens didn't have any antagonistic intentions towards her, the likelihood that they would gain significant support among the Lords of Westeros is high. So having Helaena as a sort of hostage to encourage the Greens to fight against their own supporters would be a convenient card for her to play once this almost inevitably comes to pass. She is simply attempting to use the favor of her father in order to put potential rivals like the Valyrians and the Greens into a position where they will be unwilling or unable to act against her once he's gone. Again, she is not doing anything that anyone else wouldn't, but she is trying to gain great advantages over powerful people in order to disadvantage them. She is knowingly attempting to commit treason by seating Jace on the Iron Throne and Luke on the Driftwood Throne. And she is attempting to make the Valyrians and the Greens complicit in that treason by yoking their families to her potentially sinking ship. While she certainly would have wanted to present the Jace and Helaena marriage proposal as an attempt to reunite a broken family, it is impossible to overlook that this reunion would play pretty much entirely to Rhaenyra's political advantage. And Alicent isn't the villain for not wanting to endanger Helaena or the rest of her family by making them all beholden to Rhaenyra's goals. Ultimately, this is a marriage pact that would have solved nothing. The existence of Aegon, Aemond, and Daeron was always the problem and would always be the problem, and marrying Jace and Helaena does absolutely nothing to affect that. It is an arrangement that would have put Helaena in mortal danger and would have essentially weaponized her against her own family. Therefore, to see it as the ideal solution to resolving the rivalry between the Greens and the Blacks is a radical oversimplification and willful misinterpretation of the political motivations and meanings behind the potential match of Jace and Helaena. But what do you think? Could a betrothal between Rhaenyra's oldest son and Alicent's only daughter have prevented the Dance of the Dragons? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.